Good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth. This is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, May 23rd. This week, privacy and transparency are colliding with some of the biggest political and public policy questions in the country. We begin with a network update on Bill C-22, the federal lawful access bill that civil liberties groups are warning could expand surveillance powers and weaken online privacy protections. Then we turn to Alberta, where the voter list breach continues to grow in significance, with new reporting on U.S. political technology links, court filings, safety risks for domestic violence survivors, and unanswered questions about how the personal information of nearly 3 million Albertans was exposed. Across Canada, we look at privacy disputes involving short-term rental addresses, migrant access to healthcare, workplace AI, and the sex offender registry. On access to information, we track Ontario's new transparency restrictions, jail overcrowding, environmental accountability fights in Erin, climate modeling in Newfoundland and Labrador, Hydro-Quebec secrecy, and Uber's lobbying in Halifax. And internationally, we look at public records and accountability stories from Romania, the United States, and Michigan, where freedom of information continues to show what governments and institutions would otherwise leave hidden. Let's dive in. We begin with a network update. Our friends at the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group are mobilizing Canadians to speak out against Bill C-22, the Federal Lawful Access Act. We are encouraging people to support their efforts and send letters to the editor, contact MPs, and make public opposition to the bill more visible. The letters take less than 5 minutes to fill out and get sent to trusted publications. Bill C-22 is one of the most serious privacy threats to Canadian civil liberties Canada has seen in decades. The concerns are significant. The bill makes it easier for police to access personal information. It could require companies to create technical access points for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. It could also allow government orders requiring companies to preserve personal information for up to a year, creating large stores of metadata because of data and retention laws. That creates obvious privacy risks. It also creates security risks because large stores of retained data can become attractive targets for hackers, foreign governments, and other bad actors. And the concern is not only what the bill allows today, but what infrastructure it builds for tomorrow. Once surveillance powers are expanded, rarely are they rolled back. ICLMG has made a letter-writing tool available to help people raise these concerns in their own words. While there is template language, it is important to use your own words to oppose this blatant privacy risk. We encourage listeners to use it, share it, and keep this issue in front of MPs and the public. And while we're talking about democratic accountability and personal information, we also encourage listeners to visit voterprivacy.ca, that is voterprivacy.ca, and sign House of Commons petition E7237. That petition calls for stronger privacy protections for federal political parties. And as the next segment shows, this is not an abstract issue. The Alberta voter data breach continues to be one of the most important privacy stories in Canada, even as the spring sitting for Alberta government comes to a close. New reporting is adding detail to what was already a very serious incident this week. The story moved directly across the border. Canada's National Observer reports that Alberta voter data was found on a website connected to 10x Votes, a U.S. Republican voter targeting project linked to the Centurion Project. The Centurion Project, led by Alberta separatist organizer David Parker, is already under investigation by Elections Alberta, Alberta's Information and Privacy Commissioner, and the RCMP over alleged unauthorized use of Alberta's list of electors. That list contains names and residential addresses for nearly 3 million Albertans. According to National Observer, the 10x Votes subdomain contained names and addresses for several thousand Albertans, concentrated in central Alberta communities including Red Deer, Penhold, Innisfail, Delburne, and Sundre. The site reportedly allowed users to search for people and claim them, quote, claim them, a function similar to the Centurion Project app, where users could identify people and submit information about their political views. About 150 Albertans were marked as claimed. The origins of the data are not yet known. National Observer reports that it may not be the same dataset as the official electors list. It could have come from another source, including a data broker or mailing list. But the concern is clear. A US-linked political technology platform appears to have been used to test or host an Alberta voter targeting app using real Albertans' names and home addresses. And when National Observer showed the site to Elections Alberta investigators, the agency reportedly appeared unaware it existed. Within hours, the app was taken offline. Press Progress has also reported that 10x Votes was created by Michigan political operatives Drew Bourne and Drew Weirda, and was promoted during the 2024 U.S. election as a tool for identifying and mobilizing low-turnout Republican voters. Press Progress also reported that U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra had previously promoted 10x Votes when he was chair of the Michigan Republican Party. Hoekstra told Press Progress he was not aware of any relationship between 10x Votes and the Centurion Project and denied any financial involvement with the app. But Parker has publicly described the Centurion Project as the result of working with 10x Votes, calling it the, quote, 10x/the Centurion Project app, end quote. Court documents reported by CBC News add another layer. Investigators used fictional names embedded in official elector lists to trace the apparent source of the leaked data. According to the filings, those false entries matched a list legitimately provided to the Republican Party of Alberta in June 2025. Elections Alberta is now seeking a permanent injunction requiring any copies of the voter list to be destroyed, saved information deleted, and the names of anyone who accessed or received the list turned over to investigators. The risk of serious harm is not theoretical. The Cochrane Eagle reports that Big Hill Haven, a domestic violence survivor support organization, says the breach creates urgent safety risks. For people fleeing abuse, privacy and confidentiality can be the difference between safety and danger. If a home address becomes accessible, it exposes survivors and undermines safety plans. Elections Alberta says it has heard from hundreds of concerned Albertans, including domestic violence survivors, law enforcement, and marginalized communities. Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has also raised concerns after footage reportedly showed his private information during a demonstration of the database. And Edmonton councillor Aaron Paquette says his office is helping a woman facing domestic violence relocate because she fears her information may have been exposed. Former election commissioner Lorne Gibson told National Observer the data could be worth millions of dollars. He also warned that if the data is transferred to U.S.-based systems, it may be subject to U.S. legal demands. Gibson also criticized Alberta's Bill 54, which raised the threshold for public complaints before Elections Alberta launches an investigation. CBC has reported that Elections Alberta did not take formal action against the Centurion Project until nearly a month after receiving an initial complaint. That delay matters, because it is no longer only a story about a database. It's a story about political data, separatist organizing, foreign-linked technology, public safety, and whether election and privacy laws are strong enough to protect people when voter information is misused. And it points to a larger national problem. At the federal level, political parties are not treated equally and operate under special laws with reduced privacy protections that are weaker than those applying to many businesses, charities, and public bodies. Alberta is showing what that can mean in real time. So, we encourage listeners to visit voterprivacy.ca, again, voterprivacy.ca, and sign House of Commons petition E7237. Canadians should not have to wait for a federal-scale breach before Parliament gives voters meaningful privacy rights. Now turning to Canadian privacy stories. In British Columbia, the Canadian Press reports that the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner has ruled that the City of Vancouver must refuse to disclose the addresses of short-term rental operators. The ruling was passed because it would reveal where these short-term rental operators live their private lives. The adjudicator also claimed it would expose operators to potential, quote, harassment, financial harm, and reputational damage, end quote. The dispute goes back years. Housing advocate Roanna Roselle sought business license and address information to help determine whether short-term rentals were complying with rules requiring them to be operated from an owner's principal residence. The adjudicator found that business license numbers were not sensitive and that the information could already be found online. but disclosing operators' home addresses would reveal where they live their private lives and could expose them to harassment, reputational damage, or financial harm. The decision shows the tension that often sits at the center of privacy and transparency disputes. Despite not being successful, Rizal said he felt the years of seeking transparency from the city and company were worth it. There is a real public interest in enforcing housing rules and understanding how short term rentals affect long term housing supply. But there is also a real privacy interest in not publishing residential addresses tied to identifiable individuals. The result is a reminder that transparency systems need to support accountability without unnecessarily exposing people to personal risk. And in British Columbia, LGI reporter Isaac Van Ney at the Tyee reports on sanctuary health and the long fight to ensure migrant workers, refugees, and undocumented people can access healthcare without fear. The story follows advocates who have spent decades helping people navigate medical systems when immigration status, cost, or fear of deportation becomes a barrier to care. For some migrants, even going to a hospital can feel risky if they believe their personal information may be shared with immigration authorities. Due to this fear, the founder of Sanctuary Health said he started connecting clients to the Reach Community Health Clinic in Vancouver. Sanctuary Health began as a network of health workers and community advocates and has evolved through refugee health cuts, local access without fear campaigns, and changing federal immigration policy. Through this, Sanctuary Health has evolved into a network of healthcare workers willing to take on patients off the record and even into an organization that migrants call in their times of need. Now, advocates say they are preparing for greater need as work and study permits expire and more people may fall into precarious status. The organization is now ramping up its outreach efforts, running information sessions, and even preparing for a US-style immigration crackdown. This is a privacy story because access to healthcare depends on trust. People need to know that seeking treatment will not expose them to unrelated enforcement consequences. And it is an access story because the right to care means little if people are too afraid to use it. Staying with the Tyee, LGI reporter Isaac Van Ney also reports on the growing push to adopt artificial intelligence in workplaces and the resistance from workers. At Vancouver's Web Summit, AI developers and federal officials described a future where AI tools are integrated deeply into work. A recent KPMG survey of Canadian executives found that 2/3 said their organizations were making progress toward a fully integrated AI human workforce to increase employee input. But about 1/3 also reported employee resistance. Those concerns include job security, trust, ethics, and transparency. The article notes that major employers, including software companies, banks, and the federal government, are investing in AI while also laying off workers. In-house AI tools are being used to speed up work, such as censoring personal information from documents, streamlining IT issue tickets, and retrieving information from databases. This is where privacy and labor rights meet. AI systems can reshape how workers are monitored, evaluated, assigned tasks, and potentially replaced. Now, employees may be expected to delegate some of the more time-consuming tasks to AI tools where appropriate. For adoption to be legitimate, workers need more than assurances. They need clear rules, meaningful transparency, and a say in how these systems are deployed. And in the Prince George Citizen, LGI reporter Bob Mackin reports that a man convicted of sexual assault has lost a constitutional challenge to a lifetime sex offender registry order. This requires him to register as a sex offender and report his whereabouts to police for life. Wayne Michael James Dick argued that mandatory lifetime registration violated his charter rights because of his work and travel patterns across British Columbia, including time spent in remote areas for hunting and fishing. Justice Andrew Majawa found that Dick had not shown the reporting requirements were grossly disproportionate. Majawa said reporting appointments can be arranged in advance and that registration centers are located within reasonable proximity to where Dick lives, fishes, and hunts. The court accepted that registration obligations can be onerous, but they also found they serve a public safety purpose by giving police longer periods of access to information about offenders at greater risk of reoffending. The case is a useful example of how privacy and liberty interests are weighed against public safety. The registry requires detailed reporting about residents, employment, and whereabouts. And the court found that, in this case, those obligations did not outweigh the public interest in maintaining the registration order. Now to access to information across Canada. We begin in Ontario, where the Canadian Press reports that the province's new, more restrictive Freedom of Information law has shut down another request. This one involved records relating to the Health Minister Sylvia Jones and some hospital deficit reduction plans. More than 70% of Ontario hospitals are forecasting deficits, and hospitals were told to prepare 3-year plans to balance their budgets. The Canadian Press filed an FOI request in November for records related to those plans in the minister's office. The ministry took a 90-day extension, then missed its own disclosure deadline. Since then, several requests for updates have gone unanswered. In the meantime, Ontario passed legislation placing records of the Premier, cabinet ministers, and their staff outside the reach of Freedom of Information requests, retroactive to 1988. That change now blocks the request. It was reported that the law also cut off access to hundreds of records about the Greenbelt scandal, which saw Ford announce and then reverse plans to open the protected lands to developers. This is exactly the accountability problem access laws are designed to prevent. When hospitals are cutting staff and services, the public has a strong interest in knowing what information government used, what options were considered, and how decisions were made. Instead, the new law has closed the door. And staying in Ontario, the Canadian Press reports that the province plans to expand jail capacity by 2,500 beds over the next decade at a cost of $3 billion. Internal government documents also show the province aims to add nearly 6,000 jail beds by 2050, a move critics estimate will cost at least $7 billion. The government says it will build new jails, expand existing ones, reopen closed facilities, and hire 700 new correctional officers. But the transparency hook is critical. Recent data obtained through Freedom of Information laws show Ontario's jail system was operating at an average of 127% capacity in 2025. Government data shows there were, on average, 11,058 inmates inside provincial jails in 2025, with an average jail capacity for 8,676 inmates. The same data shows the system has grown more crowded every year since 2020. And as of April 1st, 81% of people in Ontario jails were awaiting trial and presumptively innocent. Provincial institutions hold people who are accused of a crime but have not been released on bail, as well as those serving sentences of less than 2 years. Inmates with longer sentences are housed in the federal prison system. Without FOI, the public would have far less insight into the scale of overcrowding, the growth of pretrial detention, and the evidence being used to justify billions in new correctional spending. Meanwhile, in Erin, Ontario, LGI reporter Anushka Yadav at The Pointer reports that residents are still pressing for answers about a wastewater treatment facility and its potential impacts on the West Credit River. The issue centers on a proposed effluent cooling system designed to protect cold water habitat, including brook trout. Studies warn the river's fragile cold water ecosystem, one of the last self-sustaining brook trout habitats in southern Ontario, would require strict environmental protections. Residents and environmental advocates have spent years reviewing environmental assessments, technical studies, and the government approvals tied to the project. Then 3 requests asking the province to elevate the project to a more rigorous environmental review process were denied. The concern is that treated wastewater could warm the river, reduce dissolved oxygen, and damage one of the last healthy brook trout sub-watersheds in southern Ontario. A former progressive conservative environment minister said an individual environmental assessment was not required, and that the town had demonstrated that it has planned and developed the project in accordance with the provisions of the municipal class environmental assessment. The story is also about transparency. Residents describe years of trying to understand how project assumptions changed, how population projections grew, and whether environmental safeguards would be in place before the facility begins operating. The local coalition says it is still waiting for clear answers on timing, approvals, and what happens if the plant is allowed to operate before the cooling system is ready. And in a related Aaron story, LGI reporter Isabel Buckmaster at guelphtoday.com reports that residents are asking council to reconsider its approval of a multi-year gravel pit restoration project in Hillsburg, also known as the Hillsburg Pit. This follows council amending its site alteration bylaw in February to exempt applications from the originally mandated 2-year limit. The project could run for 10 to 15 years and bring heavy truck traffic through the community. The timeline was based off the amount of fill required for restoration. Concerned Citizens of Erin says its concerns include process, community safety, environmental risk, and long-term financial exposure for the town. Erin is anticipated to receive $10,719,810 in project revenue, since the total amount of clean fill is projected to be 5,359,905 cubic meters, and the town has a tipping fee of $2 per cubic meter. The group has filed a Freedom of Information request because it is worried council may have made its decision based on incomplete or inaccurate information. That is a familiar access to information pattern. When residents believe key decisions are being made on uncertain evidence, FOI becomes one of the few tools available to test what government knew, what it was told, and what it chose to rely on. Turning to Newfoundland and Labrador, LGI reporter Justin Brake at The Independent reports on whether the province can expand oil and gas production while still meeting its climate targets. The story, reported with Ricochet, says the province has never publicly released its greenhouse gas projections for 2050. But an access to information request obtained a figure, 4.2 megatons. Compared to other oil-producing provinces like Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador's emissions from fossil fuel extraction are relatively low, but on a per capita basis, the province ranks high given its small population and the size of its offshore oil industry. That matters because Newfoundland and Labrador is continuing to promote its offshore oil development while also saying it can reach net zero emissions by 2050. The government says its modeling includes potential offshore growth. But the article reports that the access request did not produce the formulas or calculations behind that modeling. The government's projection that Newfoundland and Labrador will be emitting 4.2 MT in 2050 was highlighted, with a note that the 2050 projections are not published. This is where access to information becomes central to climate accountability. Targets are not enough. The public needs to see the assumptions, projections, and trade-offs behind government claims, especially when public revenue, energy policy, and climate commitments are being balanced against each other. In Quebec, the Canadian Press reports that Hydro-Quebec fought to keep parts of 1960s correspondence secret because it said disclosure could affect ongoing energy negotiations with Newfoundland and Labrador. The documents related to electricity discussions connected to the broader historical context of Churchill Falls. A university professor requested the records through Quebec's access law. The utility blacked out sections of text on several pages of documents it returned, arguing that even decades-old information could reveal negotiating strategies and hurt its position. Quebec's Access Commission disagreed and ordered the records released. The utility's actions have been described as overkill and an attempt to control a narrative. The case is striking because the records are more than half a century old, yet the public utility still argued secrecy was necessary. For historians, journalists, and the public, this is a reminder that access disputes are not only about current files, they are also about who gets to understand the historical record and who controls the narrative around major public decisions. And finally, in this access segment, the Canadian Press reports that documents obtained under Nova Scotia's Freedom of Information law show Uber's behind-the-scenes lobbying in Halifax. The records show Halifax Mayor Andy Fillmore met with an Uber lobbyist one day before persuading council to delay a vote on proposed changes to ride-hailing oversight. The proposed changes would have required ride-hailing drivers to submit background check results to the municipality, aligning them more closely with taxi and limousine drivers. Uber opposed the change. Included in the 40 pages of documents is a slideshow that highlights Uber's safety standards and contributions to the community, as well as pointed criticism of the proposed amendment. The documents show emails, presentation materials, and language later echoed in the mayor's motion to create a committee instead of moving ahead with the proposed bylaw amendments. There is no suggestion the lobbying broke any rules. Halifax does not have a lobbyist registry, which means details of the meeting and related correspondence would not have been disclosed to the public without a formal request under the province's Freedom of Information law. That means the meeting and correspondence became public only because of an FOI request. It is a clean example of why access laws matter. Without them, the public may never know how corporate lobbying intersects with local decision-making. Now to international stories. In the United States, the Associated Press reports that emails obtained through a public records request show FBI Director Kash Patel took part in what officials described as a VIP snorkel around the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. Patel defended the trip as recently as this week as purposely planned in connection with a cybercrime investigation involving the Italian authorities. The sunken battleship is a military cemetery and one of the most solemn memorial sites in the United States. The FBI had publicized Patel's official visit to Hawaii, but did not disclose the snorkeling excursion or a later return stop. The National Park Service, which administers the site in coordination with the Navy, told AP it was not involved in Patel's swim and declined to comment on the excursion. It also declined to answer questions about any other such outings. The records raise questions about official travel, access to protected memorial spaces, and the line between public duties and privileged experiences. Again, the key point is access. The story became public because records were obtained. Without those emails, the public would have only the official version of the trip. In Michigan, Bridge, Michigan, and the Associated Press report that cities, counties, townships, and local governments have spent only 17.7% of opioid settlement funds received so far. Local governments had received $214 million and spent $38 million, leaving about $176 million sitting in accounts. Those funds are meant to respond to the opioid crisis, which continues to kill thousands of people in Michigan. On average, a Michigander dies every 6 hours from an opioid overdose, with about 2,000 dying last year. The report itself is an accountability breakthrough. Earlier reporting had shown that Michigan was not tracking how local governments were spending the money. Bridge used Freedom of Information requests to reveal that local governments were sitting on a total of $90 million in funds, with 4 in 10 communities not having spent any of their funds yet. That reporting helped lead to new reporting requirements. It is a strong example of journalism, public records, and accountability producing a better transparency system. And finally, the Associated Press reports from Ohio, where Vice President J.D. Vance's anti-fraud campaign has turned to Medicaid fraud allegations in his home state. The move has complicated state Republican politics, including for Vivek Ramaswamy, the party's nominee for governor. The public records angle is important here too. Records obtained by the Associated Press show that Ohio's former Medicaid director had been resisting an oversight committee's access to fiscal experts before that committee was disbanded. A spokesperson for the past Medicaid director defended the governor's record and the record of the state's $43 billion Medicaid program, which serves more than a quarter of all Ohioans. The spokesperson also noted that Ohio consistently ranked among the top states in the nation for prosecuting Medicaid fraud, with 2,300 indictments, 2,200 convictions, and $644 million recovered since 2011. That matters because Ohio Republicans are now promising stronger action on Medicaid fraud, while questions remain about why earlier oversight structures were weakened. Taken together, these international stories show the same pattern we see in Canada. Whether the issue is official travel, opioid funds, or healthcare oversight, access to records gives the public a way to compare official claims against what institutions actually did. That's it for this week's Access and Privacy Online News Summary. Thank you for listening, and thank you for following the stories that shape privacy, transparency, and democratic accountability in Canada and beyond. If you value this work, please subscribe, share the podcast, and support FIPA's news monitoring and public education work. You can also visit voterprivacy.ca, that is voterprivacy.ca, to learn more about political party privacy reform and sign House of Commons petition E7237. This episode was written by Sean Fisk. Music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this has been Access and Privacy Online from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe and stay informed.